She had three things to her name that morning: a father who owed more than he owned, a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was nearly gone, and a refusal so clear, so calm, and so utterly unexpected that the most powerful duke in England had actually laughed at her. He was still laughing when she walked out of the room. He would not be laughing for long. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Elizabeth Ashford noticed it because her father never received letters before noon. He was not the kind of man people wrote to urgently. He was the kind of man people avoided. But there it was, sitting on the breakfast table beside his untouched eggs, sealed with dark wax and stamped with a crest she did not immediately recognize. She recognized it by the time he finished reading it. The Duke of Merrington. Everyone in the county knew that crest. Everyone in England knew that name. The Duke of Merrington did not write letters to men like her father. The Duke of Merrington did not think about men like her father at all. And yet, her father set the letter down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hands are not entirely steady. He picked up his fork. He put it down again. Then he looked at Elizabeth across the table, not the way a father looks at a daughter, but the way a man looks at something he has just realized he can use. She had seen that look before. It never ended well. "You will need to press your blue dress," he said. "I have no blue dress," Elizabeth said. "It was sold in March." He waved his hand as though March were an irrelevant detail. "Then press whatever you have. We are expected at Merrington Hall by 4 o'clock. Elizabeth set down her own fork. She had learned over 23 years to be very still when her father used that voice. Stillness gave her time to think, and she needed to think now. "Why," she said carefully, "are we expected at Merrington Hall?" Her father smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. "Because the Duke has a problem," he said, "and you are the solution." Merrington Hall was exactly what she had expected, and nothing she was prepared for. The drive alone was nearly a mile, lined with oak trees so old they seemed to lean toward each other across the road as though sharing secrets. The house at the end of it rose out of the gray afternoon like something that had always been there, and intended to remain long after everything else had crumbled away. Stone, symmetry, windows that caught the light and gave nothing back. Her father talked the entire way. He talked about the Duke's fortune, about the Duke's estate, about the Duke's bloodline and his horses and his properties in 3 counties. He did not once mention the Duke himself. Elizabeth did not ask. She was still thinking. She had pieced it together by the time their carriage stopped. Her father's debts, and there were many, she was not naive, had reached someone important enough to reach the Duke of Merrington. The Duke had a reason to want a quiet, convenient arrangement. Her father had a reason to offer one, and Elizabeth was the arrangement. She smoothed her skirt as the footman opened the door. The dress was not the blue one. It was gray, practical, and had been mended twice at the left sleeve. She did not apologize for it. The Duke of Merrington was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, heavier perhaps, the kind of man whose power had settled into him like furniture, comfortable, immovable, slightly dusty. James Calloway, the 7th Duke of Merrington, was none of those things. He was tall in a way that seemed almost inconsiderate of the room around him, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with the kind of stillness that did not come from peace but from long practice of controlling whatever was underneath it. He stood at the far end of a room full of books and did not come forward when they entered. His steward came forward. The Duke himself looked up, looked at her father, looked briefly at Elizabeth. The way one looks at weather coming in through a window, noting it without particular interest, and then looked back at the papers on his desk. Elizabeth felt something settle quietly in her chest. So that was how it was. Her father was speaking. He was using his charming voice, the one he saved for men with money, and the Duke was listening with the particular patience of someone who has already decided the outcome of a conversation and is simply waiting for it to conclude. After a few minutes, the Duke finally set down his pen. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice was even, unhurried. "I assume your father has explained the arrangement." "He has explained his version of it," Elizabeth said. Her father made a small, sharp sound beside her. The Duke's gaze moved to her with slightly more attention than before. "And do you have questions?" "Only one," she said. "When you say arrangement, do you mean marriage?" "A legal marriage, yes, in name. The terms would be—" "No," Elizabeth said. The room went very quiet. Her father stopped breathing beside her. The steward looked at the floor. Even the fire seemed to pause. The Duke looked at her, really looked, for the first time since she had entered the room. And then, slowly, with the full and deliberate weight of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered, he smiled. And then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, precisely. It was something almost worse. It was the laugh of a man who finds something amusing that he does not expect to remain amusing for long. Brief, controlled, and entirely at her expense. "Miss Ashford," he said when he had finished, "I don't think you understand the position your family is in." "I understand it completely," Elizabeth said. "It is you who does not understand mine." She turned to her father. His face was the color of old ash. "I would like to go home now," she said quietly. She walked to the door herself. No one stopped her. She did not look back at the Duke. But she heard him just before she reached the hall. He was still laughing. She stared at the ceiling that night for a long time. By morning, she had made a decision. If they were going to force her hand, she was at least going to make certain it cost him something. He came himself. Elizabeth had expected the steward, perhaps a solicitor, perhaps another letter with that dark wax seal, more formal this time, more threatening. She had spent the morning preparing for all of those possibilities, rehearsing her answers the way one rehearses for an argument one cannot afford to lose. She had not prepared for the Duke of Merrington to appear at her front door on a gray Wednesday morning, alone, without announcement, holding nothing but his gloves in one hand. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, made a sound Elizabeth had never heard from her before, something between a gasp and a prayer, and stepped back so quickly she nearly knocked over the umbrella stand. The Duke stepped inside as though he had been inside before, as though he owned it. He might, Elizabeth thought, very soon. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not invite him to sit. She did not move from where she stood at the bottom of the stairs. "My father is not at home." "I know," he said. "I am not here to see your father." The silence that followed was the kind that required management. Elizabeth managed it. "Then I suggest you say what you came to say," she said. "I have things to do this morning." Something moved briefly across his expression, not quite amusement this time, something more careful. "May we sit?" he said. "If you prefer." The drawing room was small and cold because they had not lit the fire yet. Elizabeth did not apologize for this either. She sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and watched him take in the room, the worn upholstery, the curtains that had faded unevenly, the small watercolor above the mantel that was the only thing of any real value left in the house. He looked at none of it long enough to be rude. She noticed that. "I am not here to repeat my father's offer," he said. "Good," she said. "I am here to make a different one." Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned that silence was frequently more useful than words, and considerably harder to twist. The Duke leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and for a moment he looked less like a duke and more like a man who was choosing his words with unusual care. "My grandfather's will," he said, "contains a condition. I am required to be married before my 32nd birthday or a significant portion of the estate passes to a cousin I have no interest in enriching." He paused. "I turn 32 in 6 months." "I see," Elizabeth said. "I do not want a wife," he continued, with a directness that was almost startling. I want a name on a document, 6 months. A legal marriage quietly conducted with terms that protect us both. At the end of it, a generous settlement and an annulment on grounds we can arrange discreetly. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. And in exchange, she said slowly, my father's debts. Settled in full. And my own income during those 6 months. He blinked very slightly. That was not part of. I am aware it was not part of what you planned to offer, Elizabeth said. I am telling you what I require. The silence this time was different. It had weight to it. She could feel him recalibrating. How much, he said. She told him. He was quiet for 3 full seconds, she counted, and then he nodded once. Agreed. I am not finished, she said. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Of course you aren't, he said, and it was not quite rude and not quite admiring and somewhere uncomfortably between the two. I will have my own rooms, she said. I will not be produced at dinners or events without prior agreement. I will not be spoken to as your father's steward spoke to me yesterday, as though I am an inconvenience that has learned to talk. And I will not, she said very clearly, be laughed at again. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, and she did not entirely expect this, he inclined his head. Not a dismissal, something closer to acknowledgement. Those are your terms, he said. Those are my terms. He stood. He picked up his gloves from the arm of the chair. He looked at her one more time, and she had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he was seeing her differently than he had the day before, not better, necessarily, and not worse. Just differently. As though she had shifted slightly in the frame and he was still deciding what he was looking at. I will have the documents drawn up by Friday, he said. I will read them carefully, she said. I would expect nothing less. He moved toward the door, then stopped, did not turn around. Miss Ashford, for what it is worth, yesterday, I should not have. No, Elizabeth said simply, you should not have. He left. Elizabeth sat in the cold drawing room for a long time after she heard the door close. She stared at the watercolor above the mantel, a small landscape, green hills, a river catching light somewhere in the distance. Her mother had painted it. She thought about 6 months. She thought about what 6 months of security felt like when you had spent the last 3 years without it. She thought about the Duke's face when she had given him her terms, that careful, recalibrating silence. He had agreed to everything. That was either very good, she thought, or it was the beginning of something she had not yet thought of. She suspected it was both. The documents arrived Friday morning, as promised. They were thorough, fair, even fairer than she had expected. She read every line twice. She changed 2 words and sent them back. He sent them back again, unchanged, with a single line at the bottom in his own handwriting. As agreed, M. She signed her name beneath his initial. She told herself it was a business arrangement. She told herself that for quite some time afterward. Marrington Hall was colder on the inside than it looked from the road. Not cold in the way of stone and winter, though it was both of those things. Cold in the way of a house that had stopped expecting people, that had arranged itself around absence so long it had forgotten what presence felt like. The fires were lit in all the right rooms. The floors were clean. The flowers in the entrance hall were fresh. And yet, Elizabeth felt it the moment she stepped through the door. Something in this house had been held very still for a very long time. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Garrett, small, straight-backed, with gray hair pulled so tightly from her face it seemed to be holding her expression in place. She welcomed Elizabeth with perfect correctness and not 1 degree of warmth beyond it. She showed her the main rooms, the dining room, the library, the morning room, the east and west wings, with the efficient pace of a woman who has done this before and found it largely pointless. Elizabeth followed and said little and noticed everything. The portraits in the main hall were all Calloway men going back 2 centuries, dark-haired most of them, serious-faced, the kind of ancestors who seemed to be watching the room rather than decorating it. Near the end of the gallery there was a gap, a lighter square on the wallpaper where a frame had hung and been removed. She did not ask about it. Not yet. Her rooms were in the east wing. Large, well-appointed, recently prepared. Someone had put a small vase of early roses on the dressing table, pale pink, slightly improbable for the season. She did not know who had thought to do that, but she noticed it. She unpacked her own things. She did not have a lady's maid. This had not been discussed in the terms, and she had not raised it, because the terms had already pushed as far as she felt was wise, and because she had been dressing herself for years without difficulty. She hung her dresses in the wardrobe, 3 of them. They looked very small in the space. She did not see the Duke until dinner. He was already seated when she came down, which she thought was interesting. Either he had not considered that he might wait for her, or he had considered it and decided against it. She could not yet tell which kind of man he was about details like that. He stood when she entered, that at least. They sat at opposite ends of a table built for 14. The distance between them was significant enough that she briefly considered whether this was intentional or simply the default configuration of a table one had thought to rearrange. The soup came, the wine came. Outside, rain began against the tall windows. "Was the journey tolerable?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are your rooms satisfactory?" "They are very comfortable, thank you." He nodded. He looked at his soup. She looked at hers. This, she thought, is going to be a very long 6 months. "You don't have to do that," she said. He looked up. "Ask questions you don't want the answers to," she said. "I am not a guest you need to manage. You may ignore me at dinner if that is more comfortable. I will not be offended." He was quiet for a moment. "Most women would be offended," he said. "I am not most women," she said, "as I believe we have already established." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The memory of one, perhaps. "No," he said, "we have established that." They ate the rest of the soup in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Less effortful somehow. As though they had agreed, without saying so, to put down something heavy they had both been holding. She found the locked door on her 3rd day. She had been exploring, carefully, quietly, in the early mornings before the house fully woke. It was a habit from childhood, from a house where it was better to know the geography of every room before you needed it. It was at the end of a corridor on the 2nd floor, east wing, past a linen cupboard and a room used for storing trunks. An ordinary door, painted white, with an ordinary handle. Nothing marked it as different from any other door in the corridor. Except that when she tried it, it did not open. And the keyhole had been filled. She stood in the corridor for a moment looking at it. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a young housemaid, barely 17, wide-eyed, stopping abruptly with an armful of folded linens. The girl looked at the door, then at Elizabeth, then very deliberately at the floor. "That corridor doesn't lead anywhere, ma'am," she said, "to the floor." "I can see it leads to a door," Elizabeth said, not unkindly. "Yes, ma'am." The girl's grip on the linens tightened. "Will you be needing anything this morning, ma'am?" Elizabeth looked at the door once more, then at the girl. "No," she said, "thank you." The girl left quickly, too quickly. Elizabeth walked back down the corridor slowly, thinking. A locked door was not unusual in a house this size. Rooms were locked all the time, for storage, for privacy, for any number of ordinary reasons. But a keyhole that had been filled was different. A keyhole that had been filled was a room someone had decided would never be opened again. That evening she went to the library. Not for information, not yet. She went because she had loved libraries her entire life with the specific devotion of someone who had spent years in rooms where the books were the most reliable company available. The Merrington Library was extraordinary. Floor to ceiling, 3 walls, a rolling ladder on brass rails, and a fireplace large enough to stand in. She was on the ladder with a volume of natural history when she heard the door open. She did not come down. She was on the third shelf from the top, and she had just found the page she wanted, and she was not going to lose her place. Below her, the Duke stopped. She heard him see her, not a sound exactly, but the particular quality of someone's silence when they have encountered something unexpected. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Your Grace," she said, without looking down. "The Pennington History of English Birds, 1743. Did you know it contains 17 documented errors in the section on marsh warblers?" Applause. "I did not know that." "Most people don't." She turned a page. "I won't be long. The library is yours." "It is also," he said after a moment, "yours, for the next 6 months." She looked down then. He was standing at the foot of the ladder, looking up, and his expression was the same one she had noticed before, that recalibrating look, as though she kept moving and he kept having to find her again. "Do you come here every evening?" she asked. "When I can." "Then we can share it," she said. "I don't disturb easily." She went back to the marsh warblers. After a moment, she heard him cross to the far side of the room, heard the familiar sound of a book being drawn from a shelf, heard the chair by the fire accept his weight. They read for 2 hours. Neither of them spoke again. But when Elizabeth finally climbed down and said good night and walked to the door, she paused without meaning to, because the room felt different than it had when she came in. Warmer, maybe, fuller. She went upstairs and told herself it was just the fire. It was Mrs. Garrett who told her, in the end. Not willingly, not warmly, but with the particular resignation of a woman who has decided that the truth is less dangerous than what someone might imagine in its place. They were in the linen room together on Saturday morning. Elizabeth had insisted on understanding the household accounts, which had produced in Mrs. Garrett an expression of profound surprise followed by reluctant respect. When Elizabeth asked, as casually as she could manage, about the corridor on the second floor, Mrs. Garrett went very still. "That is Master William's room," she said after a moment. Her voice was different. Everything about her was different for just that sentence. "The Duke's brother," Elizabeth said carefully. "Yes." Mrs. Garrett straightened a stack of linens that did not need straightening. "He died 4 years ago. He was 19. Elizabeth said nothing. "His Grace had the keyhole filled the week after the funeral," Mrs. Garrett said. "He has not spoken of it since. None of us speak of it." She looked at Elizabeth then, directly, for the first time, with an expression that was not quite a warning and not quite a plea. "None of us." Elizabeth held her gaze. "I understand," she said quietly. Mrs. Garrett nodded once. Then she went back to the linens, and Elizabeth went back to the accounts, and neither of them said another word about it. But Elizabeth thought about it for the rest of the day. She thought about a 19-year-old boy, about a keyhole filled with such finality, about a man who laughed at things that startled him and went silent about things that broke him. She thought about the gap in the portrait gallery, the lighter square on the wallpaper where a frame had hung. She thought about how a house could hold grief the way water holds cold, invisibly, completely, until you put your hand in and felt it all at once. That night she lay in bed and listened to Marrington Hall settle around her in the dark, and for the first time since she had signed her name beneath his initial, she felt something she had not budgeted for. She felt sorry for him. She told herself that was dangerous. She was right. It started with an argument about horses. Elizabeth had not planned to have opinions about the Marrington stables. She had not planned to have opinions about anything that was not strictly within the terms of their arrangement. 6 months, she had told herself. Keep your head down. Keep your distance. Sign what needs signing, appear where you are required to appear, and in 6 months walk away with your father's debts settled and enough money to begin something of your own. That had been the plan. The plan did not survive contact with a horse named Calloway's Ghost. He was a gray stallion, enormous and bad-tempered, with a scar along his left flank and eyes that suggested he had strong views about everyone who came near him. Elizabeth had found him on her fourth morning, during her early walk through the grounds, standing at the far fence of the paddock with his back to the stable hands, as though he had decided to resign from the entire enterprise of being managed. She had stood at the fence for a long time, just looking at him. He had eventually turned around and looked back. They had reached an understanding. She had been visiting him every morning since, quietly, without announcement, bringing whatever she could find that seemed appropriate. He was not friendly, exactly, but he was honest, which she had come to value more than friendliness. On the Thursday of her second week, she arrived at the paddock to find the head groom, a heavy-set man named Dawson, attempting to put Ghost through a training exercise that Ghost was refusing with the full force of his considerable personality. Two stable hands stood at a safe distance looking uncomfortable. Dawson was red-faced and getting redder. Elizabeth watched for approximately 90 seconds. "He won't do it that way," she said. Dawson turned. He had not heard her approach. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been doing his job for 20 years and does not require commentary from a woman in a gray dress. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, in a tone that did not beg anything. "He's been overworked on his right lead," Elizabeth said. "He's compensating. If you keep pushing him left, he'll only get worse." "With respect, ma'am, I've been handling this animal for—" "I can see how you've been handling him," Elizabeth said, not unkindly, simply factually. Dawson's face went a shade darker. She did not hear the Duke arrive. She became aware of him the way one becomes aware of a change in weather, not a sound exactly, just a shift in the quality of the air around her. He was standing at the paddock gate. He had clearly been there for at least a moment. His expression was unreadable. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "Are you advising my head groom on stable management?" "I am offering an observation," she said. "Dawson may do with it whatever he thinks best." The Duke looked at Ghost, who had taken the opportunity of everyone's distraction to wander to the far corner of the paddock and begin eating grass with pointed indifference. "What observation?" the Duke said. She told him. He listened. He looked at the horse. He looked at Dawson, who was now studying the fence post with great concentration. "Try it," the Duke said to Dawson. Dawson tried it. Ghost, with the air of an animal who has been waiting for someone to be sensible, cooperated immediately. There was a silence. "Where did you learn that?" the Duke said. "My mother's brother kept horses," Elizabeth said. "I spent summers there as a child." He looked at her for a moment, that recalibrating look again, the one she was beginning to recognize and had not yet decided how to feel about. "You are full of information you don't volunteer," he said. "You have not asked," she said. "No," he said, "I haven't." They walked back to the house in silence, but it was the library silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need to be filled. She noticed that too. The arguments became a pattern. Not angry arguments, or not only angry ones. Arguments about the household accounts, which she had continued to review, and he had continued to pretend not to notice her reviewing. Arguments about the dinner menu, which she changed once without asking and he discovered and said nothing about, which she interpreted as permission. Arguments about the proper way to prune the rose beds along the south wall, which became somehow a 20-minute conversation about his grandmother who had planted them, and who sounded, from his description, like someone Elizabeth would have liked very much. He argued the way he did most things, with control, with precision, choosing his words carefully and deploying them efficiently. She argued the way she had learned to argue in a house where she had to fight for everything she said to be taken seriously, with patience, and with facts, and with the particular stubbornness of someone who has been underestimated so many times it has become a tactical advantage. He won some of them, she won more. She noticed that he never raised his voice. She noticed that he listened, actually listened, in the way that some people only pretend to do while waiting for their turn to speak. He tracked what she said. He remembered it. 3 days after she mentioned, in passing, that she had never learned to play chess because no one had thought to teach her, she found a chess set on the table in the library with a note in his handwriting. The first move is called the opening. The object is not to capture as many pieces as possible. The object is to think further ahead than your opponent. M. She had stared at that note for longer than she intended. She learned chess. She was, within a week, beating him with some regularity. He did not seem to mind. If anything, he seemed to find it interesting, which she found more alarming than if he had minded. It was raining the evening she found him in the portrait gallery. She had not been able to sleep. This happened sometimes in new places, her mind refusing to settle. And she had come downstairs for a book and taken a wrong turn in the dark, and found herself at the entrance to the gallery without entirely meaning to. The Duke was standing in front of the lighter square on the wallpaper, the gap, the place where a portrait had been removed. He had a candle. He was not looking at the gap exactly. He was looking at the portrait beside it, a younger version of himself, perhaps 20, standing beside a boy of about 15, dark-haired, both of them. The boy was laughing at something outside the frame. Elizabeth stood very still at the entrance to the gallery. She should leave. She knew she should leave. This was not a moment that belonged to her, and she had not been invited into it. She stayed. After a moment, without turning around, the Duke said, "His name was William." Elizabeth did not move. "I know," she said quietly. "Mrs. Garrett told me." He said nothing for a moment. The candle moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. "He was 19, the Duke said." "Yes." "He was," he stopped, started again. "He was the kind of person who made a room better by being in it. I don't know how else to describe it. Some people have that. He had it from birth." A pause. "I never had it." "That is not true," Elizabeth said, before she could stop herself. He turned then, looked at her across the length of the gallery. In the candlelight, his face was stripped of its usual careful management. He looked tired. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been holding something very heavy for 4 years and had stopped being able to pretend it wasn't heavy. "You have known me for 3 weeks," he said. "Not cruel, just precise." "Yes," she said, "and in 3 weeks I have seen you listen to a housemaid's problem with the kitchen stove as though it mattered. I have seen you ride back to the village in the rain because you thought you might have short-changed the blacksmith by 6 pence. I have seen you lose at chess 6 times without once making me feel as though I should have let you win." She paused. "You do not make a room better simply by walking into it. You do it slowly, by degrees, and it takes longer to notice. But it is there." The gallery was very quiet. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she could not name, not quite surprise, not quite gratitude, not quite either. "You notice a great deal," he said at last. "It is a habit," she said, "from living in rooms where I had to." He looked at the portrait once more, at the laughing boy. Then he turned away from it and moved toward the door toward her, to pass her in the corridor, and as he did he paused for just a moment beside her. "Good night, Miss Ashford," he said. "Good night, Your Grace." He walked down the corridor. She stayed in the gallery doorway and looked at the portrait and the laughing boy and the lighter square on the wall where something had been removed, and she thought about degrees, about things that happened slowly and were harder to notice. She went to bed. She lay awake for another hour. She was not thinking about the locked room. She was not thinking about the arrangement or the terms or the 6 months counting steadily down. She was thinking about a man who rode back in the rain for 6 pence. This, she told herself firmly, is exactly what you were warned about. She was warning herself with increasing frequency. She noticed that too. Lady Vane arrived on a Friday. Elizabeth knew something was coming before she knew what it was. The house told her, the way houses do, when you have learned to listen to them. Mrs. Garrett moved through the corridors with a tightness around her mouth that had not been there the day before. The footmen were quieter than usual. Even Ghost, when she visited him that morning, seemed restless at the fence, turning his head toward the drive as though he could hear something still too far away for human ears. The Duke said nothing at breakfast, but he was at breakfast, which was unusual. He normally took his coffee in the study, and she took hers in the morning room, and they had arrived at this arrangement without discussing it, the way they had arrived at most of their comfortable arrangements. That he was sitting across from her at the breakfast table, reading his correspondence with slightly more attention than the letters appeared to warrant, told her something. She ate her toast and did not ask. At 10:30, the carriage came up the drive. Elizabeth was in the morning room with the household accounts. She had taken to keeping them herself now, which Mrs. Garrett had initially resisted and now, she suspected, was quietly relieved by when she heard it. The sound of wheels on gravel, the particular rhythm of a well-sprung carriage traveling fast. She did not go to the window. She kept her eyes on the column of figures in front of her and listened to the sounds that followed. The carriage stopping. The footman. The door. A voice in the entrance hall. A woman's voice, low and musical, and carrying the precise confidence of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. Then the Duke's voice, even controlled. Then nothing, because they had moved somewhere she could not hear them. She added up the column of figures. Then she added it up again because she had done it wrong the first time. She met Lady Vane at dinner. The Duke had come to find her in the afternoon, knocked at the morning room door, which he did not usually do, and stood in the doorway with the careful expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was managing something. "We have a guest," he said. "Lady Vane will be staying for several days. She is," a brief pause, barely perceptible, "an old acquaintance of the family." "Of course," Elizabeth said. She kept her voice pleasant, neutral, the voice she used when she needed to think and did not want anyone to know she was thinking. "Dinner will be at 8, he said. "I will be there," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely decode. Something in it that might have been apology, or might have been warning, or might have been both. Then he nodded and left, and Elizabeth sat for a long time looking at the household accounts without seeing them. Lady Vane was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, not warmly, not accidentally, but with full knowledge and complete deployment of every advantage available. She was perhaps 30, dark-eyed, dressed in deep green that made the rest of the room look slightly underdressed by comparison. She wore her confidence the way she wore her jewels, as though she had been born with both and could not imagine being without either. She looked at Elizabeth across the dinner table with a smile that was perfectly formed and reached precisely as far as her teeth. "How charming," she said, when the Duke introduced them. Her eyes moved over Elizabeth's gray dress with the speed and efficiency of a customs officer. "And how very brave of you, my dear, to take on a house like this." "I find it very comfortable," Elizabeth said. "Of course you do," Lady Vane smiled. "Marrington Hall has a way of impressing people who haven't seen a great deal of well." She turned to the Duke with a warmth that was entirely different from the warmth she had just not offered Elizabeth. "James, you look tired. You have been working too hard again." James. Elizabeth noted the name. She noted the way Lady Vane used it, easily, proprietorially, the way one uses the name of somewhere one considers home. The Duke looked, if anything, slightly more controlled than usual. "The estate has been demanding," he said. "It always is." Lady Vane reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, just a moment, just her fingertips, but with the absolute assurance of a woman who has touched that hand before and expects to do so again. "You need someone to take better care of you." Her eyes moved to Elizabeth as she said it. Elizabeth picked up her wine glass and looked at the candles and said nothing, which she found was frequently the most powerful available response. Dinner was long. Lady Vane talked beautifully about London, about dinners and assemblies, and people whose names Elizabeth did not know, delivered with the implicit understanding that not knowing them was a deficiency. She talked about the Duke's townhouse and the improvements she had suggested to his study, and the hunting party in October at the Pemberton estate where the Duke had apparently been quite the talk of the county. The Duke listened and responded in his even, unhurried way and revealed nothing. Elizabeth ate her dinner and watched them both with the quiet attention she had spent 23 years developing, and by the time the dessert course arrived, she had formed several conclusions. Lady Vane and the Duke had a history. This was not in question. Lady Vane considered that history to be ongoing. This was also not in question. And Lady Vane had not come to Marrington Hall to visit an old acquaintance of the family. She had come because she had heard about the arrangement, and she had come to see exactly what Elizabeth Ashford was, and exactly how easily she could be removed. She did not have to wait long to find out how Lady Vane intended to do it. The next morning, Elizabeth came down to find Lady Vane already installed in the morning room, her accounts on the desk, her chair by the window occupied by a woman in ivory silk who looked up with an expression of mild, theatrical surprise. "Oh, I do hope I haven't displaced you," Lady Vane said, making no movement whatsoever to rise. "I always used this room when I visited. Such lovely light. I didn't think. Well, I assumed you would have your own arrangements." Elizabeth stood in the doorway and looked at the room and looked at Lady Vane and made a decision. "Not at all," she said pleasantly. "I'll use the library." She took her accounts to the library and spent the morning there and did not think about it. Or told herself she did not think about it, which was a different thing entirely. The assault, when it came, was elegant. Lady Vane did not shout. She did not make scenes. She was too accomplished for any of that. She operated instead through a series of small, beautifully executed maneuvers, each one deniable, each one precise, each one designed to shift the ground slightly further beneath Elizabeth's feet. She rearranged the flowers in the entrance hall. She suggested at dinner that the East Wing rooms were perhaps better suited for guests. Just an observation, of course. She would never presume. She mentioned, twice in Elizabeth's presence, the name of a woman she referred to as Poor Caroline, and watched Elizabeth's face when she said it, and smiled slightly at what she found there. Elizabeth did not ask who Caroline was. She was not going to ask. She asked Mrs. Garrett instead, on the third morning, in the linen room, in the matter-of-fact tone she had found was most useful with Mrs. Garrett. Mrs. Garrett was quiet for long enough that Elizabeth thought she might not answer. Then she said very evenly, "Lady Vane and His Grace had an understanding some years ago, before Master William died. It came to nothing." A pause. Lady Vane has a different recollection of how it came to nothing. "I see," Elizabeth said. "She comes every year," Mrs. Garrett said. "She always has some reason. She always stays too long." She folded a pillowcase with more force than it required. "She will leave eventually. She always does." Elizabeth nodded. She was about to let it go, about to file it away with the other things she was not thinking about, when Mrs. Garrett added, without looking up from the linen, "She is not a woman who loses gracefully, ma'am. I would—" Another pause, a careful one. "I would be watchful." Elizabeth looked at her. Mrs. Garrett met her gaze briefly. In her eyes was something Elizabeth had not expected to find there, given the coolness of their first weeks together, something that looked very much like concern. "Thank you, Mrs. Garrett," Elizabeth said quietly. "Will that be all, ma'am?" "Yes, thank you." The maid found her the following afternoon. Not Mrs. Garrett, the young one, the wide-eyed girl from the corridor outside the locked room. Her name was Polly, and she had, over the past weeks, developed the habit of appearing whenever Elizabeth seemed to need something and disappearing before anyone could notice she had helped. She was, Elizabeth had concluded, one of those quietly invaluable people that large households depend on entirely and acknowledge almost never. Polly appeared in the library doorway with the look of someone who has been deciding something for several hours and has finally decided. "Ma'am," she said, "I thought you should know." Elizabeth set down her book. "Sit down, Polly." Polly sat, perching at the very edge of the chair with the careful posture of someone who has not been invited to sit in this room before. She twisted her hands in her apron. "Lady Vane was in His Grace's study this morning," she said. "For a long time I wasn't listening," she added quickly. "I was doing the great, but the door wasn't entirely—" "I understand," Elizabeth said. "Go on." "She had a letter," Polly said. "She was showing him a letter. I couldn't hear all of it, but I heard—" She stopped, twisted her apron harder. "She said it was proof. That was the word she used, proof. And she said if he didn't, another stop. I couldn't hear the rest. He said something very quiet, and she said, louder, that Miss Ashford, that you, ma'am, that you had only come for the money, and that he knew it, and that everyone knew it, and that when the 6 months were up, he would be exactly where he started and she would still be there." The library was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees along the drive, that sound like water running over stones. "And the letter," Elizabeth said carefully, "did you see what it was?" Polly shook her head. "Only that it was old. The paper was, it looked old. And His Grace, when he took it," she hesitated. "He looked at it a long time, ma'am, and then he went very still, the way he goes still when something is wrong." Elizabeth sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Polly. You did right to tell me, and this conversation—" "I never heard anything, ma'am," Polly said, with a dignity entirely disproportionate to her 17 years. "I was doing the great." "Exactly so," Elizabeth said. Polly left. Elizabeth sat in the library and looked at the fire and thought about old letters and proof, and a woman who had been coming to this house every year and never quite leaving, and never quite arriving at whatever it was she wanted. She thought about the Duke going very still. She thought about what Polly had said, that when the 6 months were up, he would be exactly where he started and she would still be there. It was designed to sound like concern. It was designed to sound like the observation of a woman who knew him and cared for him and simply wanted him to see clearly. It was a blade dressed as a hand extended in friendship. She recognized the technique. She had grown up with a man who used it constantly. She saw Lady Vane that evening before dinner. Not by accident. She had decided on reflection that she was not going to wait. She found her in the drawing room, already dressed, sitting with the ease of a woman in her own home. Lady Vane looked up when Elizabeth entered and smiled her perfect smile and said nothing, which was itself a kind of statement. Elizabeth sat down, not across the room, near enough that this was clearly a deliberate conversation. "I won't pretend," Elizabeth said pleasantly, "that I don't know why you're here. And I won't pretend I haven't noticed what you've been doing this week, because we would both know that wasn't true, and I find pretending wasteful." Lady Vane's smile did not change. If anything, it became more assured. "My dear Miss Ashford—" "I am not finished," Elizabeth said in the same pleasant tone. Lady Vane stopped. "I don't know what the letter is," Elizabeth said, "and I am not going to ask you, but I want you to understand something, and I want you to understand it clearly." She looked at Lady Vane without blinking. "I am not afraid of you. I have lived in a house with a man who used people as instruments for 23 years. I know exactly what it looks like, and I know exactly what it costs, and I am not going to sit across a dinner table from you every evening and pretend I don't see it." The smile had changed now. Something behind Lady Vane's eyes had shifted, a reassessment, quick and sharp. "You are very confident," Lady Vane said, "for a woman in your position." "My position," Elizabeth said, "is more secure than you would like it to be. That is what's bothering you." A silence. Lady Vane looked at her with an expression that was no longer the performance. That was the thing underneath the performance, which was colder and more interesting and considerably more honest. "He will not choose you," she said, quietly, without the smile now. When this is over, whatever you think is happening here, he will revert to what he knows. He always does. I have watched him do it for 10 years. She tilted her head slightly. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because I think you are not as foolish as most women and you deserve to know the odds. Elizabeth looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, she said, for your candor. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door. Miss Ashford. She turned. Lady Vane held her gaze. In her hand, Elizabeth now noticed, was an envelope held loosely, almost casually but held. You should know, Lady Vane said, that the letter is not what you think. It is not about his debts or his estate or anything so straightforward. A pause, almost imperceptible. It is about you. Elizabeth stood very still. About me, she said. About your father, Lady Vane said. About what he did, and about what the Duke does not yet know. She looked down at the envelope. I have known for some time. I debated whether to use it. Her eyes came back up. I have decided to give you the choice. If you leave quietly before this goes further, the letter stays with me. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed. Elizabeth stood at the threshold of the drawing room and looked at Lady Vane and the envelope, and felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but contained elements of both, cold and clarifying, like water from a deep well. Keep your letter, she said. Lady Vane blinked. For the first time all week, something genuinely surprised her. Whatever is in it, Elizabeth said, he can hear it from me. She walked out. She kept her pace even all the way down the corridor, around the corner, past the portrait gallery, until she was in the east wing staircase with no one to see her, and then she stopped with one hand on the banister and stood very still and breathed. Whatever is in it, he can hear it from me. She had said it with conviction. She had said it as though she knew what it was and had already decided. She did not know what it was. She had not decided anything. She climbed the stairs slowly and went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and tried to remember everything her father had ever done that someone else might call proof. It took her a while because there was quite a lot to choose from. Lady Vane left the next morning. Not dramatically, not with the sweeping exit of a woman who has been defeated. Lady Vane was far too skilled for that. She left efficiently, pleasantly, with a warmth directed at the Duke that managed to exclude Elizabeth from the room without ever once mentioning her name. She kissed his cheek in the entrance hall. She said she hoped to see him in London in the spring. She said Marrington Hall was as beautiful as ever, which was the kind of thing people say about places they intend to return to. At the door she paused and turned, and found Elizabeth standing at the top of the stairs. Their eyes met. Lady Vane smiled, not the performance smile, not the blade-dressed-as-friendship smile, but something smaller and more genuine, and Elizabeth thought, almost respectful. Then she was gone. The carriage disappeared down the oak-lined drive. The footman closed the door. The house exhaled. The Duke stood in the entrance hall for a moment with his back to Elizabeth. Then he turned and looked up at her on the stairs, and his expression was the closed, carefully managed one. The one she had learned meant something was happening underneath that he had decided not to surface. I trust the week was not too uncomfortable, he said. It was perfectly fine, Elizabeth said. He nodded. He went to his study. He closed the door. She stood on the stairs a moment longer. Whatever Lady Vane had shown him in that letter, he had not raised it. He had not come to find her. He had not asked her a single question that she was going to have to answer. This was either very good or very bad, and she could not yet determine which. November arrived, and with it the first real cold. Frost on the windows in the mornings. The oak trees along the drive stripped bare, their branches making complicated shapes against a sky the color of pewter. The gardens folded themselves inward for the winter, and the house drew closer around its fires, and Elizabeth found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not mind any of it. She had not expected to be content here. She had expected to endure it, to manage the days with her customary efficiency and keep her eyes on the calendar and feel the 6 months as a countdown. She had been very clear with herself about that in the beginning. An arrangement, a transaction, a temporary address. And yet, she had a routine now. Early mornings with Ghost at the fence, who had progressed from tolerating her presence to actively looking for her, which she chose not to read too much into because she was already reading too much into too many things. Breakfast, sometimes with the Duke, sometimes alone, both versions having their own particular quality. The accounts in the morning, which she had organized now into a system that actually made sense, and which Mrs. Garrett had taken to consulting as though this had always been the arrangement. The library in the evenings always, the fire and the books, and more often than not the Duke on the other side of the room doing something with papers or correspondence, or occasionally, she had noticed, simply sitting. She had learned his silences. That was the thing she had not anticipated, not just that he had different silences, but that she would learn to read them. The silence that meant he was thinking. The silence that meant he was tired. The silence that meant something had happened that he was not going to talk about but that sat in the room between them like furniture, present and undeniable. She had learned his habits too. Coffee before anything else, black, 2 cups, a third if the morning correspondence was bad. The way he rubbed his left hand when he had been writing too long. The route he walked when he was working through a problem, east garden, through the gate, along the back wall, return. Exactly 20 minutes. She had timed it without meaning to. This, she told herself, was simply observation. This was what she did. She noticed things. It did not mean anything beyond itself. She was becoming less convincing on this point. It was in the 3rd week of November that he told her about William. Not the managed version, not the careful, public grief of a man who has decided how much of something he is willing to show. The real version. She did not ask for it. She did not maneuver toward it. It came because of a book. She had been reading in the library Cowper's poems, which she had found tucked behind a row of heavier volumes as though someone had hidden them there, when she turned a page and found handwriting in the margin. A boy's handwriting, rounded and enthusiastic and not entirely consistent in its letter forms, next to a verse about winter. This one is W's favorite. He made me read it 4 times. J. She had been looking at it for perhaps 30 seconds when she realized the Duke had come in and was standing at the far end of the room and had seen what she was looking at. She did not close the book. She did not pretend she had been looking at something else. She held it up slightly so he could see the margin. He crossed the room, sat down not across from her, in his usual chair, but closer, in the chair beside her, which he had never done before. He took the book from her hands without asking and looked at the margin for a long moment. He used to come in here and read aloud, he said. Whether anyone wanted him to or not, he didn't consider that a relevant factor. A pause. He was always right that it wasn't. Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned when nothing was the right thing. He was ill for 2 years before he died, the Duke said. His voice was even. Too even, the evenness of someone who has said a thing so many times in his own head that he has worn all the feeling off the surface of it, but the feeling is still there underneath, intact and waiting. I was in London for most of it, a state business, parliamentary sessions, things that seemed at the time to require my presence. He stopped. They did not require my presence. Nothing required my presence as much as he did, and I was not here. The fire settled in the grate, rain against the windows, steady and quiet. You couldn't have known, Elizabeth said. I knew he was ill. You couldn't have known how much time there was. No, he set the book down on the table between them. But I could have come anyway, and I didn't because he paused. Something moved through his expression, briefly unmanaged. I was afraid of watching it, of being present for it. I told myself it was practical, that there was nothing I could do, that he was being well cared for. He looked at the fire. He was 19 years old and he was alone, and I was in London telling myself there was nothing I could do. The rain, the fire, The book on the table with its boy's handwriting in the margin. "And the room," Elizabeth said very quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "I could not go in after, and then I could not go in, and then more time passed and I still could not go in, and at some point it seemed better to simply—" He stopped. "It is not better. I know it is not better. It is only easier." Elizabeth looked at his profile, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the way he was holding himself with that careful, practiced control that she now understood was not coldness, had never been coldness, but was the posture of a man who had learned that if he held himself still enough, things could not get in. Things could not get out either, but that, she understood, had seemed like an acceptable trade. "William would not want," she started. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Please, don't tell me what he would want. Everyone tells me what he would want. They mean well and they are probably right, and I cannot—" He stopped again. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. "I know what he would want. I know it exactly. That is the part that is hardest to sit with." Elizabeth sat with him in silence for a long time. She did not tell him it would get better. She did not tell him grief had a shape and an end. She did not offer him anything, because she had learned by now that he did not want to be offered things. He wanted to be in the presence of someone who was not asking him to be different than he was. She could do that. She had been doing it for weeks without either of them naming it. After a while, he reached over and picked up the book again, and found the poem William had loved and read it aloud, quietly, to the rain and the fire and Elizabeth sitting beside him in the chair. His voice did not waver. She thought it was one of the bravest things she had ever seen. December came. The 6 months were more than halfway gone. Elizabeth had stopped looking at the calendar. She noticed she had stopped and told herself to start again, and then did not start again, which told her something she was not ready to hear directly. She and the Duke had reached a new level of something that neither of them had named. Not the arrangement. The arrangement had been a framework, a set of terms on paper, and what they had now had expanded so far beyond that framework that the original document seemed almost quaint. They ate breakfast together every morning now, without it having been decided. He consulted her on estate matters, not performatively, not as a courtesy, but because he had discovered she had good judgment, and he was a man who, whatever his flaws, valued good judgment above almost everything. She had begun to know his tenants by name, had ridden out with him twice to visit the cottages on the north side of the estate where the roof repairs had been delayed, had sat across a kitchen table from an elderly farmer named Hodge and his wife and drunk extremely strong tea, and listened to their concerns about the winter drainage, and then, on the ride back, told the Duke exactly what she thought should be done about it and why. He had done it. All of it exactly as she said. He had not told her he was going to. She had found out from Hodge's wife, who sent a note to the house addressed to the Duchess. The first time anyone had used that word in relation to Elizabeth, and she had held the note for a moment before opening it with a feeling she did not entirely investigate. She was not the Duchess. She was a woman with a name on a document and 47 days remaining on an arrangement. 47 days. She had started counting again without meaning to. It was Mrs. Garrett who saw it first. Or rather, Mrs. Garrett was the first to say it, which was not the same as seeing it first. Elizabeth suspected Polly had seen it weeks ago. She suspected most of the household had seen it. Large houses were not private places, regardless of what their occupants preferred to believe, and the people who ran them saw everything and said nothing, and understood the whole story long before the principal characters had worked out the first chapter. Mrs. Garrett said it on a Tuesday morning in the linen room, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things that were true and inconvenient. "He is different," she said, folding a sheet with the precision of someone who has been folding sheets for 30 years. "Since you came." Elizabeth did not look up from the inventory she was checking. "People adapt to new arrangements," she said. "This is not adaptation," Mrs. Garrett said. She folded another sheet. In 4 years, I have not once heard him read aloud in that library. The inventory blurred slightly. Mrs. Garrett, Elizabeth started. I'm not saying it to cause difficulty, Mrs. Garrett said. I am saying it because in 6 weeks you will be gone and someone in this house ought to say it plainly before then. She looked at Elizabeth directly, with the expression Elizabeth had first seen in that corridor outside the locked room, not quite warning, not quite plea, but containing something of both. He will not say it. You know he won't. That is not how he is built. A pause. But you are not built that way either, and one of you will need to be different, or it will simply, she stopped, smoothed the folded sheet with one hand. End, she said, as things do when no one says them. Elizabeth stood in the linen room for a long moment. Thank you, Mrs. Garrett, she said. Mrs. Garrett nodded once and went back to her sheets and said nothing else, which was its own kind of kindness. She found the letter on a Wednesday. Not Lady Vane's letter. She had never found that one and had stopped looking, and had decided she was going to tell him herself whatever it was when the time came. This was a different letter entirely. She found it in the locked room. She had not broken in. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had been in the corridor, she walked that corridor sometimes, she had admitted this to herself without examining it too closely, and she had noticed that the door was slightly, fractionally ajar. Not open, not unlocked, but the latch had not caught, and the draft from the window at the end of the corridor had pushed it, and it was ajar. She stood in the corridor for a long time. Then she pushed it open. The room was small, smaller than she had expected. A boy's room, a young man's room, somewhere between the two, which made sense for someone who had died at 19 and been frozen there. A narrow bed, neatly made, as though someone had made it 4 years ago and no one had come in to unmake it. A desk with books stacked on it. A window looking out over the south garden, the glass furred with cold. On the windowsill, a row of small stones, river stones, smooth and various colors, arranged in a line with the careful deliberateness of someone who had collected them one by one, and had a reason for each one. On the desk beside the books, a letter, sealed, with a name on the outside. James. Elizabeth stood very still in the doorway. She did not go in. She stood at the threshold and looked at the letter with William's handwriting on it. The same rounded, enthusiastic, not quite consistent lettering she had seen in the margin of the poetry book, and understood that it had been here for 4 years, and the Duke had not been in to read it because the Duke had not been in this room at all. He did not know it existed. Or the other possibility, the worse one, he knew it existed and could not come in to read it. She stood there for a long time. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor below, his footsteps. She knew them now as well as she knew the house's own sounds, and she pulled the door quietly back to its almost closed position, and walked quickly to the end of the corridor and down the servants' staircase, and stood in the back hall with her heart doing something irregular, and her hands not entirely steady. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone wall. She thought, I have to tell him. She thought, I do not know how to tell him. She thought, there are 29 days left. She did not tell him that day, or the next. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself it required care. Both of these things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. And the whole truth was that every time she thought about telling him, she thought about what came after telling him, about being in that room with him, about what that letter might contain, about what it would mean to be the person who had brought him to it. And she felt something so enormous and so unwieldy that she could not find the edges of it. 29 days, 27, 25. She stopped sleeping well. The Duke noticed. She saw him notice, the way she saw everything now, the slight pause when she came to breakfast, the extra attention in his gaze when he thought she was not looking. He did not ask. He was not a man who asked directly. But he left a book on her chair in the library one evening, not one of his, a different one, a collection of letters by a woman who had traveled alone through Italy in the 1760s, which was so precisely the right book that she sat with it in her hands for a full minute before she could open it. She read it in 2 days. She left it on his desk with a note. She was right about Florence. She was wrong about Rome, but she was braver than she knew. E**. He did not respond in writing, but at dinner that evening he asked her, with something in his eyes that was warm and careful and direct all at once, whether she had ever wanted to travel. And they talked for 2 hours about places neither of them had been, and places he had been, and places she had only read about. And it was the easiest conversation and the hardest one, because it was the kind of conversation that assumed a future, and they had not agreed on a future, and there were 23 days left on an arrangement that was ending. 23 days. It ended on a Thursday. Not the arrangement, the pretending. The careful maintenance of the fiction that this was temporary, that they were both managing it, that the 6 months were simply a number and not a wall approaching. She had been in the East Garden in the late afternoon in the cold, walking the path along the south wall where the rose beds were dormant and the branches were bare. She walked when she could not think clearly indoors. She had been doing it more often lately. She heard him before she saw him. The gate from the stable yard, the particular sound of it. Then his footsteps on the gravel. Then he was beside her, matching her pace without comment, which he had done before, but not like this, not with this quality of deliberateness, as though he had come specifically to find her and was taking his time about saying why. They walked the length of the south wall in silence. At the corner he stopped. She stopped beside him. The light was going out of the sky in the way it did in December, quickly, decisively, as though it had somewhere else to be. The garden was very still. Somewhere beyond the wall, a bird. "The solicitor comes next week," he said. She looked at the bare rose canes along the wall. "I know. The documents will be ready by Thursday." "Yes." A pause, the bird again, then nothing. "Elizabeth," he said. She had not heard him use her name before, not once in all these weeks. It was always Miss Ashford, correct, measured, the precise distance of a man maintaining exactly the space he had agreed to maintain. She made herself look at him. He was looking at the garden. His jaw was set and his hands were in his coat pockets, and he had the look of someone standing at the edge of something very high and deciding whether the jump was worth the fall. "There is something I should," he stopped. "I am not," another stop. He turned to look at her and his expression was unmanaged in a way she had only seen once before in the portrait gallery in the candlelight. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It sounded like it cost him something. "Say it plainly," she said. Her voice was even. She was not sure how. He looked at her for a long moment. "You should go inside," he said. "It's cold." And then he walked back the way he had come, through the gate, into the stable yard, gone. Elizabeth stood in the East Garden in the December cold, and looked at the bare rose canes, and felt something crack open quietly in her chest. She went inside. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and did not cry, because she had decided years ago that crying over men who could not manage to say what they meant was a waste of time and energy she could not afford. She sat there for a long time. Then she stood up and went to the window and looked out over the dark garden and made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to tell him about the room. Tonight, she was going to tell him about William's letter and about the door that had been ajar and about whatever came after that. She was going to stop waiting for the right moment because the right moment was not coming, and there were 19 days left, and she was done being careful. She went downstairs. He was not in the library, not in the study, not in the dining room. She found Polly in the corridor. "His Grace rode out an hour ago, ma'am," Polly said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has sensed a situation and decided to report only the facts. Elizabeth nodded, "Thank you." She went back to the library and sat by the fire and waited. He did not come back. She packed on a Sunday. She had not decided to pack. She found herself doing it the way one finds oneself doing things when the mind has made a decision the rest of one hasn't caught up with yet. Opening the wardrobe, taking down the dresses, folding them into the trunk with the efficiency of someone who has moved before and knows the fastest way to do it. 3 dresses, a handful of books she had brought with her, the collection of letters by the woman who had traveled through Italy, which she then put back on the shelf because it was his and she had no right to take it, and because she could not take it without taking the conversation that went with it, and that was not hers to take either. She kept packing. She told herself this was sensible. There were 11 days remaining. She would leave cleanly, correctly, without drama and without the slow accumulation of awkwardness that 11 days of waiting would produce. She would leave him the letter, not William's letter. That was different, that she would tell him about differently. She would leave him a note. Professional, grateful, the correct tone for the end of a business arrangement. She sat down at the writing table and took out paper. She sat there for a long time. She wrote, "Your Grace." She looked at it. She crossed it out. She wrote, "James." She looked at that for even longer. She folded the paper and put it in the drawer. She went back to the wardrobe and took out the last dress and folded it and placed it in the trunk and closed the lid and sat on it because she did not know what else to do. Monday morning she came down early. Earlier than usual, before the fires were properly going, before the kitchen had finished with breakfast, before anyone was moving in the corridors. She went to the stable yard and she went to Ghost's paddock and she stood at the fence in the cold gray morning, and Ghost came to her immediately, which he never used to do, and put his large head over the fence rail, and she pressed her forehead against his jaw and stood there. "I know," she said, to the horse, to the morning, to no one in particular. Ghost breathed out heavily, which she chose to interpret as sympathy. She stood there for a long time. Then she heard the gate. She did not turn around immediately. She kept her forehead against Ghost's jaw and listened to the footsteps cross the yard and stop a few feet behind her. "You're leaving," the Duke said. "Not a question." "My trunk is packed," she said to Ghost. "The arrangement ends in 11 days. It seemed sensible too." "Elizabeth." She turned around. He looked as though he had not slept. He was still in his riding coat from the night before, which meant he had either come directly from the stables or had not gone to bed at all, and his hair was not entirely in order and his expression had abandoned all of its usual management. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the night arriving at something and was not certain he had arrived at the right place. "Don't go," he said. The stable yard was very quiet. "James." "I know I have no right to ask it," he said. "The terms were clear and I agreed to them and I am not, this is not." He stopped, started again, and she could see it costing him, the plainness of it, the directness that did not come naturally to a man who had spent years keeping everything at the distance of careful language. "I am asking. I am simply asking. Don't go." Ghost moved behind her, restless. "You couldn't say it in the garden," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "3 days ago, you were going to say something and you walked away." "I know. I have been waiting." She stopped. "I have been waiting quite a long time for you to say something, and every time you come close you—" "I know," he said. "I know I am saying it now." "What are you saying?" she said. "Exactly, plainly." He looked at her. "I don't want you to go," he said. "I don't want the arrangement to end. I don't want 11 more days of I want." He stopped, and she could see him looking for the words the way a man looks for footing on uncertain ground, careful, slow, not willing to fall. "You changed something," he said finally. "I don't know how to put it better than that. You came into this house, and you changed something that I had stopped believing could be changed, and I did not see it coming, and I do not know what to do with it, and I am asking you, plainly, as you asked me to, please don't go." The morning light was coming up slowly over the roof of the stable block, gray turning to pale gold at the edges. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. There were things she still had to tell him. The room, the letter with his name on it in his brother's handwriting, Lady Vane and whatever was in that envelope, and whatever her father had done that someone had decided was proof of something. There were 11 days left on a document that had been signed in practical desperation on both sides, and there was a solicitor coming next week, and there were 3 dresses in a trunk upstairs, and a note she had started twice and not finished. All of that was true. And this was also true. She was standing in a stable yard in the early morning with a man who had just said please for what she suspected was one of the very few times in his life, and she knew him now. She knew his silences and his habits, and the way he went still when something was wrong, and the route he walked when he was thinking, and the way he had read William's poem aloud to the fire without his voice wavering, and she had stopped being able to pretend that she didn't. "There is something I have to tell you," she said, "before anything else, something I should have told you weeks ago." He waited. "The locked room," she said, "William's room." Something moved through his face. "The door was ajar," she said. "I didn't go in, I stood at the threshold." She held his gaze. "There is a letter on the desk, in his handwriting with your name on it." The stable yard was absolutely silent. The Duke stood very still. She watched the information move through him, watched him feel it, really feel it in a way that his face rarely showed. His jaw worked once. His eyes did something she had not seen them do before. "How long?" he said. "3 weeks," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to." "3 weeks," he said again. Not accusatory, something else. Something that sounded almost like wonder or its grief-colored cousin. "I'll come with you," she said. "If you want, or I won't, whatever you need." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out slowly, giving her every chance to move, and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with flourish. Just took her hand in his the way one holds onto something real. "Come with me," he said. They walked out of the stable yard together, across the frost-hardened ground, through the east door, up the stairs, down the corridor, to the door that had been sealed for 4 years. He opened it. The door opened quietly. No resistance, no drama. 4 years of sealed silence, and it opened the way any door opens, with the small, ordinary sound of a latch releasing, hinges turning, and the room beyond becoming visible by degrees as the light from the corridor fell across it. The Duke stood in the doorway for a long moment. Elizabeth stood beside him, slightly behind, close enough that he would know she was there and far enough that this was his to enter first. She looked at the side of his face and watched him see it, watched him take in the narrow bed with its neatly made coverlet, the desk with its stacked books, the river stones on the windowsill, each one a different color, each one placed with the deliberateness of someone who had a reason for everything they touched. His breath changed, very slightly, just once. Then he walked in. She followed. The room was cold, not the cold of winter only, but the particular cold of a space that has not held warmth in a very long time, that has forgotten the habit of it. Their breath showed faintly in the air. The frost on the inside of the window had made patterns, fern-like and intricate, across the lower panes. The Duke walked to the desk and stood before it and looked at the letter. It was smaller than Elizabeth had remembered. A single folded page, sealed with plain wax, no crest, just pressed closed, with his name on the outside in that rounded, enthusiastic handwriting that she had first seen in the margin of a poetry book. "James." He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way one looks at something that is going to change the precise shape of whatever comes after it, and knows it, and needs a moment to decide to let it. Elizabeth went to the window. She looked out over the south garden, bare rose canes, frost on the ground, the pale winter light beginning to strengthen across the lawn, and gave him the silence that the moment required. Behind her, she heard the small sound of the seal breaking. She kept her eyes on the garden. She did not hear him read it. There was no sound of paper moving, no rustle of pages. and the room was so still that she found herself holding her breath without meaning to, listening to nothing, to the frost and the cold and the pale morning and whatever was happening behind her. Then he made a sound. Not a word, not a sob, something quieter than either, the sound of air leaving a body that has been holding it for a very long time. She turned. He was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed. The letter was in both hands. His head was bent slightly over it. He was not crying, or he was, and she was not certain, because his face was turned away and the light was low and she was not trying to see. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the narrow bed and said nothing. After a moment, he turned the letter slightly so she could see it. She read it. It was not long. William had written it in what she understood from the date must have been the last weeks, the handwriting still recognizable, still his but slower, the letters more careful as though he had been paying attention to each one. James, I know you won't come. I know you think it will be easier for me if you don't, and I know you think it will be easier for you too, and I'm not going to argue with you about it because I know how you are when you've decided something. You are exactly like Father was, except you read better books. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it properly, so I'm writing it down because that's the only way I know to make you stop and actually read it instead of managing it. You have been a better brother than you think you have. I know you don't believe that. I know you've been making a list, somewhere in that orderly head of yours, of every time you weren't there and everything you didn't say and every way you fell short of what you thought you should be. I know because I know you. You've been doing it our whole lives, holding yourself to something no one asked you to be, and then quietly punishing yourself for not reaching it. Stop. I mean it, stop. You are not responsible for this. You are not responsible for me. And you are certainly not responsible for being in two places at once, which is what you would have needed to be to manage both the estate and being here, and which even you cannot manage, though I imagine you've considered it. I need you to do something for me when I'm gone. I need you to open the windows. I mean that literally, and I mean it every other way too. The house gets so dark, James. You let it get so dark. Find someone worth letting in. Let them in properly. Don't manage it. Don't arrange it. Don't make terms. Just let someone in. I'll know if you don't. You know I will. W. P.S. The stones on the windowsill are yours now. The gray one is from the river at Ashton where we fished that summer when I was 12 and you caught nothing and pretended you weren't bothered. Keep it. Elizabeth finished reading. She sat very still on the narrow bed beside a man she had married on paper 11 weeks ago as a transaction, and she looked at a letter written by a 19-year-old boy to his older brother, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too various to name grief and tenderness and something close to wonder, and underneath all of it, a very quiet, very certain recognition. She had been let in. She had not noticed it happening. He had not announced it. There had been no moment, no declaration, no clear before and after. It had happened the way the house had warmed slowly by degrees, a little more each day, until the cold was simply gone and you could not have said exactly when it left. She reached out and took his hand again, the same way he had taken hers in the stable yard, without flourish, without drama, simply because it was real and she wanted to hold it. He turned his hand over and held hers back. They sat in William's room in the winter cold and the pale morning light for a long time, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet, and they both knew it. After a while the light shifted. The frost on the window began to give way in the warmth of two people sitting near it. A thin, bright line of water ran down the inside of the lower pane, and then another, and then the fern patterns dissolved and the glass cleared and they could see the garden properly. The bare rose canes and the frost on the lawn, and at the edge of the south wall, something Elizabeth had not noticed before. The first snowdrops, white and small and improbably early, pushing up through the frozen ground at the base of the garden wall, as though they had simply decided that winter had gone on long enough. The Duke looked at them for a moment. William planted those, he said. The year before he died, he said the south wall would shelter them. A pause. I didn't think they'd survived. Things do, Elizabeth said quietly. Sometimes when they're planted right. He looked at her. She looked back. She told him everything that afternoon. She had decided, somewhere in the hour they sat in William's room, that she was done parceling things out, that she was going to say all of it and say it plainly and let whatever happened next happen. She owed him that. She owed herself that. She told him about Lady Vane and the drawing room and what had been said. She told him about the envelope and the offer, leave quietly, and the letter stays with me. She told him she had refused and said that whatever was in it he could hear from her. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, very evenly, "What did she tell you was in it?" "She said it was about my father," Elizabeth said. "About something he did. She said you didn't know." She met his eyes. "What did she show you in the study, that morning?" He looked at her steadily. "She showed me a letter your father wrote to his solicitor 6 years ago, before his debts became what they are now when he still had leverage." A pause. "He sold a piece of land that was not entirely his to sell. It had been held in trust for you by your mother's family. He had the documents altered." He stopped. "You lost your inheritance, Elizabeth. Whatever your mother left you. He took it and sold it and concealed it." The afternoon light. The fire in the study where they were sitting now, across from each other in the chairs by the window. She had known, she realized. Not this specifically, but something of this shape. She had always known her father was capable of exactly this shape of thing. It was not a surprise. It was the confirmation of something she had long suspected and had been grateful not to have confirmed. "And Lady Vane thought," she said slowly, "that if you knew you would end the arrangement, send me away. That knowing my father had done this would make me," she stopped, "less." "Yes," he said, "that was what she thought." "And does it," she said, "make me less?" He looked at her with an expression she knew now, that recalibrating look, but different this time, different from the first day and the second and all the weeks after. As though he had finished recalibrating. As though he had arrived somewhere and set down the work of finding her. "Your father's crimes are not your character," he said, "and your character is not something I am still determining." She looked at him. "I determined it," he said, "approximately 6 weeks ago, when you told me I had not asked." She remembered, "The library, the chess set, you have not asked." "What did you determine?" she said. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. The firelight moved across his face. "That you are the most honest person I have ever sat across a table from," he said. "That you see things other people arrange not to see. That you are brave in a way that is not loud. It is quiet and consistent and does not require an audience, which is the rarest kind." He paused. "And that I have been trying very hard for 6 weeks not to think about what happens in 11 days. 9, she said. He looked at her. 9 days, she said, not 11. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. 9 days. Yes. Then I have less time than I thought, he said, to ask you what I want to ask you. She waited. He did not stand. He did not reach for her hand. He stayed in his chair across from her in the afternoon light and looked at her with that steady, direct, fully arrived gaze and said, "Tear it up." She blinked. The document. The arrangement, the terms, the 6 months and the annulment and all of it. He held her gaze. "Tear it up and marry me instead. Actually marry me. Not on paper, not as a transaction." A pause. "I am aware this is not a romantic proposal. I am aware that I am sitting in a chair and that I have not." "It's fine," Elizabeth said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I laughed at you," he said. "The first day, I laughed at you and I had no right to, and I have thought about it. James. More times than I can. James." He stopped. She looked at him across the fire and felt the full weight of 9 months, of her father's voice at breakfast that Tuesday morning, of a gray dress in a wardrobe, of a locked door and a library, and a horse who had decided to trust her, and a woman named Mrs. Garrett who had said asterisk, "One of you will need to be different." And she felt something in her chest that was enormous and specific and entirely her own. "Ask me plainly," she said. He held her gaze. "Will you stay?" he said. She sat with it for one moment. One full, complete, unhurried moment, in which she was not calculating or managing or holding herself carefully against the possibility of getting it wrong. "Yes," she said. They tore up the document that evening. Not ceremonially, not with any particular drama. He found it in the study drawer where he kept the estate papers, and she took one side and he took the other, and they tore it in half, and then in half again, and fed the pieces to the study fire where they curled and blackened and were gone. They watched it burn. "Lady Vane will be furious," Elizabeth said. "Lady Vane is frequently furious," he said. "She manages it." "She will come back." "She always comes back," he said, "and she always leaves." He looked at the fire. "She will find, I think, that things are different this time." Elizabeth said nothing, but she thought about the drawing room and the envelope and Lady Vane's expression when Elizabeth had said whatever is in it. "He can hear it from me," that flash of something genuine behind the performance, that reassessment. She thought Lady Vane would probably not come back. Not this time. Some battles, she understood, were abandoned not when you lost them, but when you finally saw what you were fighting for and found it was not worth the cost. She almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She told him about the gray stone on a Thursday. They had gone back to William's room together, twice now, 3 times, each visit slightly less weighted than the last, which she understood was how these things worked when you let them. He had moved the river stones to the windowsill of the library, arranged in the same line, the same order. He had left the room itself as it was. He was not ready to change it yet, and she did not suggest it, because she understood that some things needed time and not management. The gray stone sat at the end of the line on the library windowsill. She had found him looking at it one morning. "The river at Ashton," she said. "Yes," he picked it up, turned it in his hand. "We went in the summer of his 12th year. I was 20. I thought I was doing him a favor taking him. I thought I was being a good brother." He paused. "I caught nothing the entire day. He caught 4. He was unbearably pleased about it." The corner of his mouth moved. "He made me acknowledge each one individually." Elizabeth looked at the stone in his hand. "He was right," she said, "about the windows." He looked at her. "You opened them," she said. "You did what he asked, maybe not the way he imagined, but you did it." He was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked you," he said. "Immeasurably. He would have found you within the first 5 minutes and decided you were the most interesting person in any room and made it very difficult for me too." He stopped. Set the stone back in its place on the windowsill. He would have been insufferable about it, actually. "I would have liked him too," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was warm and quiet and not managed at all. "I know," he said. They were married again on a Friday in February. Not the quiet, solicitor-witnessed affair of the first time. This was in the village church, small and cold and full of the kind of February light that is pale gold and entirely unexpected, and falls through old glass in angles that make everything look like it has been waiting to be seen properly. Mrs. Garrett was there. Polly was there, crying with the uninhibited enthusiasm of someone who feels things fully and does not consider this a flaw. Hodge and his wife from the North Farm, who had driven 2 miles through the frost because they said they wouldn't have missed it. Ghost, as a concession to practicality, was not there. But she had visited him that morning, and he had put his head over the fence rail and breathed on her in a way she chose to interpret as congratulatory. The Duke James stood beside her at the front of the church and turned to look at her when she came in, and she saw his face when he saw her, and she understood that whatever she had felt in the East Garden in December, whatever she had felt in the library and in William's room and in the stable yard in the frost, had not been one-sided. Had never been one-sided. He had simply needed longer to find the words. She had known, by then, that words had never been the point. The words were nice, she was glad to have them. But it was the sixpence that had told her. The sixpence, and the chess set, and the book about the woman who traveled through Italy, and the way he had read William's poem to the fire without his voice wavering. She had known then. She said yes again, in the village church in February, in front of Mrs. Garrett and Polly and Hodge and his wife, and the pale gold light through old glass. It sounded, the second time, like something she had always known how to say. She wrote to her father once. A single letter, short, written without anger. Anger required a kind of ongoing attention she had decided not to give him. She told him his debts were settled, as agreed. She told him she was married and would remain so. She told him she knew about the land and her mother's trust and what he had done with both, and that she did not intend to pursue it legally, but that she did not intend to pretend she didn't know. She told him she wished him well. She meant it, which surprised her slightly. She thought about it and decided it was not weakness. It was simply the particular freedom of a woman who no longer needs anything from a man and can therefore afford to wish him well. She did not hear back from him for some months. When she did, the letter was brief and contained no apology, which she had not expected, and one line that she read twice. You were always your mother's daughter. I never knew what to do with that. She folded the letter and put it away. She went to find James. Spring came to Marrington Hall the way Elizabeth had come to it, quietly, by degrees, changing things before anyone thought to notice. The snowdrops at the south wall were joined by crocuses, purple and white, pushing up through the warming ground with the stubborn confidence of things that know their season has arrived. The oak trees along the drive put out their first tentative leaves, that particular yellow-green of early spring that lasted only a week and was gone before you fully appreciated it. Ghost became insufferably cheerful and began following Elizabeth along the fence line every morning, which Dawson said he had never seen the animal do for anyone, and which Elizabeth received with the modesty appropriate to someone who has long suspected they are good with horses, but has too much sense to say so. The library was warm now. She had moved her books in properly. There were more than 3 now, because James had a habit of leaving books in her path with notes inside them, and she had developed the same habit back, and the result was a kind of ongoing conversation that spread across shelves and windowsills and occasionally the breakfast table, and that she suspected would continue for a very long time. Mrs. Garrett had thawed. Not dramatically, Mrs. Garrett did nothing dramatically, but the evidence was there for anyone paying attention. She consulted Elizabeth on household matters now with the ease of a woman consulting an equal. She had, on one occasion, produced something that might have been a smile. She had taught Elizabeth her recipe for the spiced biscuits that the kitchen made at Christmas, which Polly reported was something Mrs. Garrett had never taught anyone, and which Elizabeth received as the significant honor she understood it to be. The locked room on the second floor was still William's room, but it was not locked anymore. James had opened the window in early March, a still, mild afternoon, the first warmth of the approaching season in it, and Elizabeth had stood in the doorway and watched him do it and said nothing. He had left it open for an hour. Then he had closed it again gently and come out and shut the door behind him, not sealed, not filled, just shut, and they had walked downstairs together and not spoken of it. A week later she found fresh flowers on the windowsill inside. Snowdrops, the ones from the south wall. She did not ask. She replaced them when they faded. It became her habit for a long time. James laughed at her occasionally. Not the way he had laughed that first day, not with the distance of a man who has decided something is beneath his notice. This was different. This was the laugh of a man who found his life genuinely amusing, which she understood was not something he had expected to be able to say. She laughed at him too, more often probably. He had a dignity that was eminently laughable when punctured, and she had, she discovered, a gift for puncturing it at the moments he would least prefer, and he had discovered that he did not mind as much as he would have predicted. He told her that once in the library, on an evening in late April. "I laughed at you," he said, out of nowhere, looking at the fire. "That first day, I have thought about it a great deal." "I know you have," she said. She was reading, she did not look up. "I laughed because," he stopped. "I laughed because you startled me. No one had ever another stop. I was not accustomed to being told no by anyone, and you said it as though it were the simplest thing in the world, and something in me," he turned to look at her. "I didn't know what to do with it, so I laughed." She looked up from her book. "And now," she said. "Now," he said, "I know what to do with it." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "I married it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a careful one, a real one, the kind that surprised her on the way out, and he smiled at the sound of it with the look of a man who has discovered he likes causing it and intends to continue. "You are extremely pleased with yourself," she said. "I am," he agreed without apology. She went back to her book. Outside, beyond the library windows, the spring evening was doing what spring evenings do in England, extending itself past all reasonable expectation, holding onto the light with the stubbornness of something that knows how long the dark has been. The garden was green. The oak trees were full. Somewhere in the south garden, if she looked, she would see the rose canes along the wall already showing their first leaves, preparing for something. She did not look, she was reading. But she knew they were there. She found him in William's room on a morning in early spring. She had not been looking for him. She had been on her way to the stable yard, Ghost having developed the habit of complaining audibly if she was more than 10 minutes late, which Dawson found bewildering and she found charming. She had passed the corridor on the second floor and the door had been open and she had stopped. James was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, not in the posture of grief, not the bent head and the held-together stillness of the first time she had seen him here. He was sitting the way one sits in a room that has become familiar, that has been visited often enough to lose its weight, and he had one of the river stones in his hand, the gray one, she thought, though she could not see clearly from the doorway, and he was turning it slowly. He looked up when he heard her. "I thought you had an appointment with Ghost," he said. "I do," she said. "He'll survive 2 minutes." He looked at the stone in his hand for a moment longer. "I was thinking," he said, "that we might go to Ashton this summer, the river." He paused. "I haven't been since that summer." Elizabeth stood in the doorway. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." He looked at her and his expression was the fully arrived one, the one with no management left in it, no distance, no careful maintenance of space. Just him looking at her in a room that had learned to hold warmth again. "William would have wanted to come," he said. "I know," she said. "We'll go for him too." He nodded once. He put the stone in his pocket. He stood. He crossed the room to the window and opened it. All the way, this time, the morning air coming in with the smell of new grass and early flowers, and the particular freshness of a world that has finished being winter. And they both stood for a moment looking out over the garden where the snowdrops had given way to crocuses, and the crocuses to something more ambitious. And the rose canes along the south wall were covered now in new green leaves preparing, quietly and with great certainty, for what was coming next. The light came in. "Come on," Elizabeth said, after a moment, "or Ghost will sulk for the rest of the morning and take it out on Dawson." "We can't have that," James said. They left the room. The door stayed open behind them. The window stayed open. The morning came in and moved through the room, across the neat bed and the stacked books and the windowsill where the stones still stood in their careful line, each one a different color, each one from somewhere that had mattered, and the curtains moved in it, just slightly, the way curtains move when a room has remembered what air feels like. Down in the stable yard, Ghost made his opinion of punctuality clearly known. Elizabeth laughed all the way down the stairs. He had laughed at her refusal once. in a room full of papers and distance, with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He understood now what she had known then, that the refusal had been the only honest thing anyone had ever offered him, not a rejection, an invitation, the first real one he had ever received. He had stopped laughing by spring. He had started instead to listen. And in the listening, without quite noticing when it happened, he had found everything he had not known he was missing. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.